The global spread of Tetris is often framed as a marketing triumph. The reality is far more clinical. The distribution of the world's most recognizable puzzle game was the result of a systemic failure in contract architecture. In the 1980s Soviet Union, intellectual property as a private asset did not exist. Every line of code belonged to the state, specifically managed by a monopoly apparatus known as Electronic Nortechnica, or Elorg. Inside the Dorodnitsin Computing Center of the Academy of Sciences, a researcher named Alexey Pajitnov was experimenting with pentomino puzzles in his spare time, eventually programming a game called Tetris. He wrote the first version on an Electronica 60, a Soviet clone of a PDP-11 computer. Because this machine lacked a graphical interface, Pajitnov built the game's falling blocks out of simple text characters, using brackets and spaces. When the game leaked across the Iron Curtain to a research institute in Hungary, a British software broker named Robert Stein saw it. Stein immediately sent a telex to the computing center in Moscow to secure the rights. The computing center sent back a non-committal response, expressing interest in a future deal. Stein incorrectly interpreted this unverified, untranslated handshake as a legally binding master license agreement. In software engineering, attempting to access memory that hasn't been allocated creates a null reference, an error that crashes the program. By proceeding without an actual signature, Stein generated a legal null reference, infecting every subsequent sublicense with the exact same defect. To track how this intellectual property moved, we can map it as a directed acyclic graph, or DAG. A DAG is a flowchart that models relationships moving strictly in one direction from a root source. Operating on his misinterpretation, Stein immediately began selling sublicenses to distributors in the UK and the US, branching our graph to companies like Mirrorsoft and Spectrum Holobyte. Mirrorsoft was controlled by media magnate Robert Maxwell. His massive corporate infrastructure gave the distribution network an illusion of absolute legitimacy. These companies then executed a secondary phase of sublicensing. They sold the arcade and console rights to Atari's Tengen division and Bulletproof Software. Millions of dollars in manufacturing and marketing were now committed to these endpoints. Yet, if you traced the permissions back to the root, Elorg had never actually signed the foundational contract. This entire global corporate structure was executing operations without administrative privileges, completely blind to its own legal ingle-iggy. Eventually, Elorg discovered that Stein was distributing Tetris commercially across the West without their permission. They summoned Stein to Moscow. Leveraging the threat of cutting him out of the loop entirely, Elorg coerced him into signing a formal contract to legitimize his past sales. But Elorg inserted a precise constraint into this new agreement. They explicitly restricted the rights strictly to personal computers. Mirrorsoft and Spectrum Holobyte ignored this parameter. They continued operating as if their sublicenses granted them unrestricted global platform rights across all hardware. This created an imminent legal collision. Atari was manufacturing millions of Tetris cartridges for the Nintendo Entertainment System, assuming their PC license covered it. Inserting a rigid technical limitation into an already sprawling, non-compliant distribution web guaranteed a catastrophic legal fork.
When the inevitable lawsuits arrived, the entire pace hinged on a single technical question. In 1989, what legally separated a personal computer from a video game console? A 1980s personal computer was defined by general-purpose processing capabilities. It featured alphanumeric input, typically a full keyboard, and expandable storage, like dual floppy disk drives. This definition accurately covered machines like the Commodore 64 and the Amiga, which possessed integrated keyboards and open operating systems. A video game console, specifically the Famicom or NES, operated on a completely different architecture. It utilized hardwired input pads and lacked general computing functions. Comparing the schematics directly, the NES possessed a specialized RICO processor and picture processing unit tied to a fixed ROM slot. It lacked the input and output flexibility required to meet Elorg's contractual definition of a computer. Because the machine's architecture excluded it from the definition of a personal computer, Mirrorsoft never actually possessed the console rights. Atari's entire manufacturing run was a direct IP violation. In intellectual property law, hardware taxonomy is an engineering reality. The physical architecture of a machine dictates the legal validity of the code it runs. The resolution of this conflict occurred in Moscow in February 1989. 3 separate nodes from the network, Henk Rogers representing Nintendo, Robert Stein, and Robert Maxwell's son Kevin, arrived at Elorg's offices simultaneously, entirely unaware of each other. The negotiations were defined by information asymmetry, a scenario where one party holds vital data the other lacks. Elorg knew Soviet law and the exact wording of Stein's contract, but they were completely blind to the existence of the global console market. That asymmetry collapsed when Henk Rogers placed a Japanese Famicom Tetris cartridge directly onto the desk of Elorg executive Evgeny Belikov. Belikov did not recognize the cartridge. He realized in real time that the root contract had been breached at a massive global scale by the Stein network. Elorg immediately weaponized this newly acquired data. By isolating the 3 negotiators, Belikov reverse-engineered the fractured licensing chain and trapped the offending parties into admitting they lacked console rights. Elorg executed a hard fork. They bypassed the entire corrupted Stein network and drafted a new, direct contract for the console rights exclusively with Nintendo. The network graph updated immediately. The invalid Atari and Mirrorsoft branches were deleted entirely, replaced by a single verified connection between Elorg and Nintendo. Nintendo rapidly weaponized this new, valid root license. They issued a cease and desist to Atari Games, triggering competing lawsuits in U.S. federal court. In June 1989, Judge Fern M. Smith issued her ruling. Based on the engineering evidence, the court formally adopted the strict hardware taxonomy argument. The court concluded that the NES did not meet the definition of a personal computer. Atari's license was declared void, and an immediate injunction forced them to withdraw their product from the market. The Tetris legal battle proves that in technology licensing, ambiguous platform definitions act as critical vulnerabilities. Precision in hardware taxonomy is as vital as precision in code.